Welcome back to New Foundations. Excited to bring you episode 2. Joining Bobby and I this week, we have third rotating co-host Mason Carter, co-founder of Acropolis and principal at Early Riders. And we're excited to have guest Sam Callahan, prolific Bitcoin analyst and also advisor to Acropolis. Gentlemen, what a week, what a conference. Hope you guys have caught your breath. There's just so many announcements, so much news. It's really hard to keep track of all of it. Sam, let's start with you. Just general thoughts and takeaways from the week in Nashville.
Yeah, first off, happy to be here. Bobby, Mason, hello, Joe. I thought the conference was pretty incredible, to be honest with you. The environment and just the energy there. I mean, you can feel it. You can feel that things are starting to change in Bitcoin, I would say. It's the maturation of the industry. You had billionaires, senators, presidential candidates, the largest financial institutions there, as well as obviously Bitcoiners who have driven this movement when nobody cared, when everyone was laughing at us. We're still here. We're still a huge part of the culture, but now we're bringing in all these other people who are recognizing that this technology is for real. And the energy there was just one of, like, it felt like we were more on the precipice of something. Like, we're on the brink. Like, everything that we talked about, the game theory is starting to play out, whether it's, government, nation state adoption, pension fund adoption, these large financial institutions, adoption at the political level, like starting to embrace it. I mean, it's wild. And I felt it all week. And there's just a level of excitement right now. And I don't know if you guys agree, but that's my main takeaway.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Yeah,
I completely agree. Also, happy to be here. Happy that y'all are here. And not to sound like, I feel like I've heard this phrase on so many different podcasts of, oh, if you would have told me 7, 8 years ago when I got into Bitcoin that the presidents would be talking about it, et cetera. But really, that's just what I keep talking, or that's what I keep thinking, is this timeline is accelerating, and Nashville was absolutely incredible. And it felt weird to be walking around a Bitcoin conference with Secret Service and TSA, police, private security everywhere. But yeah, we are certainly accelerating.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very different from prior years. It's not just us anymore, I think a lot of folks are like, that where you are now is the good old days, and I think it's only going to get better as more people come onto Bitcoin. And the thing that's exciting is it was a room full of optimistic people with solutions, and I think that's one of the coolest things about everyone that was there. They had a solution for some problem, and it just so happened to involve Bitcoin. And it's incredible to see so many people from different walks of life, like Sam said, senators, potential presidents, past presidents. We heard the word Overton window at least 100 times this last week, so it's happening.
And at the same time, we still have the interesting cypherpunks walking around at On-Ramp's Institutional Day. There was a guy who pulled his laptop out of a box of cereal that said Satoshio's. And I immediately stopped my conversation, went over to him, and was like, "What are you doing with this box of cereal, and why is your laptop in there?" And he goes, "Oh, it's non-KYC." And I sent him Bitcoin, and yesterday he delivered to me in Austin a box of Satoshio's. So, well, at the same time, you have President Trump, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. walking around talking about their world policies for Bitcoin. You still have the cypherpunks doing interesting things at the same time.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's an interesting. Go ahead, Sam.
no, I'll just say, yeah, the cypherpunks were busy on the open source stage, building the actual cool shit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I'd echo all your guys' thoughts and just say there was a noticeable, just calm confidence. Things are shifting. You know, Bitcoin doesn't need politicians. That being said, when two of the three leading candidates with there present and speaking, and the third one was apparently considering it at the last minute, this is catching a lot of people's attention. And the Uber drivers in Nashville were certainly getting their dosage of Bitcoin education. Some of them seemed a little overwhelmed by it. Some of them seemed that it was great. So, but anyways, onward. There's nothing you can do to stop that. So let's stick with the confidence. Just one more topic. Sam, thoughts on all of the strategic reserve talk, whether it was Senator Cynthia Lummis or RFK or if Trump. There was a lot of strategic reserve talk, which is exciting for all of us on this call. Acropolis and New Foundations is all about building on strong reserves, building and operating businesses with long-term capital. So curious your thoughts there. Any takeaways?
Well, it's obviously big news. I mean, it's hard to think of bigger news than that. Whether it actually happens or not is one thing. But, RFK Jr. came out, and I thought his speech was very focused, and he demonstrated a really deep understanding of Bitcoin. I actually had the privilege of spending time with him, and he could do it off script as well. And so his treasury strategy of, I think it was 4 million over the next 21 years. I'm kind of remembering off the top of my head. And then transferring over, what's held with DOJ into the Treasury immediately. 550 a day. That's over 100% of the daily issuance. Only one government would be buying if this somehow happened. And then obviously Cynthia Lummis, it was kind of funny because everyone left after the Trump speech, and then Cynthia Lummis comes out afterwards, and that was the big bombshell when she announced afterwards. But hers is a little different, right? It was I think it was 1 million Bitcoin over the next 5 years, and it was using excess cash. And I think there's different critiques for the different strategies. Obviously RFK Jr. is 4 million. That's more than the entire float available for Bitcoin today. And he says he's going to, spread it out, but it's just a wild number in terms of, there's only 21 million and there's even less than that because of all the ones that are lost. And then, that would have to be across multiple presidencies and it had to continue. Whereas the other one seems a little bit more, I guess, doable. And as well, it could happen in one administration, basically, 5 years to 4 years. But, it seems a little bit more possible, I guess. But I know that there's question marks in terms of how it would actually get implemented and whether it would need congressional approval. But it is exciting. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And the one thing I would say is I think there's a lot of focus on Republicans and independents there, but there was some Democrats there as well. And I think Ro Khanna, I listened to him speak, and he had some really good things to say. And so my hope is that, they're going to write a letter to the DNC and try to reset the policy from the Democratic side. And I hope that happens because really Bitcoin is bipartisan and it can bring about people from all sides. And I think this is the fun part, is that everyone's basically competing about who can be more pro Bitcoin. There was rumors that Trump was going to give 1 million, and then RFK comes out and says no, I'll do 4 million. And I was like, Kamala's going to come out and say something ridiculous, 22 million or something, because she doesn't really understand it. But she's just going to try to top him, and that's the beauty of the game theory, is that everyone, it only helps to be pro Bitcoin, not anti Bitcoin. So certainly exciting. It's surreal. It's completely surreal in my mind.
Yeah, it was really interesting how if you extrapolate out Cynthia Lummis's accumulation trajectory, it fit RFK's perfectly if you continued it, because the 550 a day over 5 years is 1 million. So curious if that was just a coincidence. It seems like it was too exact to be a coincidence. Who knows what conversations are happening in the background. I know RFK used to say even more aggressive than that. So, but it's fascinating to think about every day them buying more than the issuance. It's would you really stick to that for 20 years if other countries are starting to react to what you're doing and accumulate and things are escalating? Would you really sit back on your heels and stick to this plan for 20 years? Or if you had excess capital, would you speed that up, right? It's it's just so fascinating to just sit back and wait for these dominoes to fall.
Or just print money and buy it, You got the money printer.
Right. Exactly. How long can you resist that?
RFK wants triple maxi status. And just one thing before we move on from that RFK called out that I didn't hear anywhere else was the 1031 exchange. Mm-hmm. I was a real estate guy, or I used to always want to own buildings until I went all in on Bitcoin. But the 1031 exchange is what allows real estate investors in the United States to flourish. once you sell a building or a property, you get 6 months to roll that tax free into another one. And if they allowed the IRS, being uh, Bitcoin to be 1031 eligible, and you could sell a building and move those profits tax free into Bitcoin, would be a huge unlock for the space that I'm really excited about.
That's
Yeah,
a huge one.
that was a big difference.
It's a
For
huge
sure.
one. That they would be unreportable transactions also from fiat to Bitcoin or vice versa, which unreportable makes it untaxable. But Bobby, I think you had some thoughts. You want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like Mason. Before this year, I was working in private equity real estate for 2 years, working on small business acquisition and doing syndication deals of multifamily. And we did a podcast, and I would often have guests on who have their own funds, and many of those guys behind the scenes, because I would always just bring up Bitcoin because it relates to every conversation. And behind the scenes, they'd be like, I want to start a Bitcoin fund somehow, but I'm afraid to present it to my investors because it deviates so far from like our core investment thesis. So every one of these guys are thinking about Bitcoin and how they can capitalize on it, but a lot of folks do have money tied into real estate, and by enabling the 1031, that would just be tremendous. That would be great, and it would likely bring a lot of costs down and for living and industrial, whatever it may be. But the interesting thing, and I'll make it my last comment, was like RFK, Trump, all these politicians speaking about Bitcoin. I had a lot of friends, parents, and just folks in my immediate circle, business owners and just baby boomers alike, who were not really into it or kind of confused. They immediately were just saying, okay, how do I do this? So it really makes me think like this nation state obvious move of adoption. It's almost jumping over the businesses in some ways, because you would think some rational business owners would start wanting it for payment. They might start putting on the balance sheet. It's going to accelerate. And that's why I think New Foundations is going to be such a powerful, podcast to help business owners understand what's going on. So, I mean, you guys creating this business, Joe and Mason, it couldn't be more timely, I would say, for the modern business owner.
Yeah, we certainly agree. And you could feel it in Nashville.
What do
Just a
you
lot of people.
what do you guys say? One thing I heard a lot was like just from critics on X, because they always try to find something bad. It's just like, wait, I thought Bitcoin was supposed to take power away from the governments, and now Bitcoiners are cheering on governments. How would you guys respond to that?
I think it's fair. I think it's only natural that people are going to say that, but this is just there's an order of operations here. Bitcoin wasn't going to go right now. It's somewhere around 1.5 trillion. It wasn't going to make it to 10 or 15 or $20 trillion asset class, and then governments were going to all of a sudden wake up and it was going to become political. I think it's happening exactly how it could and the only way it could. So that's my view on it. I do want to say when it comes to some of the political conversations, Senator Cynthia Lummis, who I'm a huge fan of, she did kind of make it seem like, look, this can get us out of debt. So after 20 years, we'll just sell our Bitcoin and now we're debt free. Where I understand the messaging, and I do think the government's best chance with our debt situation is Bitcoin. That being said, this isn't about using Bitcoin to get out of your fiat problems. This is about using Bitcoin to set sturdy foundations for healthy growth in the future. And that will incorporate, swallowing up some of that past debt that you're stuck in right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if I shared my 2 cents on that, 2 sats on that, I would just say that it only makes sense. Our nation, every business, we're all individuals who play a role, and we're accountable to those who we are around. And everyone who works for the government, they're accountable to their constituents and the people. And it does only make sense. I mean, we have a debt problem. Was it 35 trillion, right? As of like yesterday, and it only makes sense to have some. I think the really aggressive, like we're going to acquire 4 million is pretty high. Like it will take a long time, like you said, Sam, but I think these politicians, they do have to draw a line in the sand and set expectations and be like, this is our game plan. And the thing that was really interesting yesterday in like Preston Pish's and Luke Groman's podcast and what Bitcoin did is they started diving into the second half of the podcast, businesses investing in like 5 and 10-year contracts, and the bond market plays a major role in that, like how they can really discern and forecast, cost of goods and all these things. And we've all heard who've been here how Bitcoin disrupts bonds. And I think the fact that nations are using it, it's going to create this almost like financial framework that businesses and institutions can use so they can forecast and have, an accurate cost of capital and just way to preserve wealth into the future. I think, Sam, you probably know a lot more about that than I, because I don't study that a lot, but that hooked my ears so much and was just so interesting.
No, I love the phrase that I heard a couple of times, which is that, Bitcoin doesn't need politicians, but politicians really need Bitcoin. And so that's kind of like summarizing what I think Bobby and Joe was saying. And I agree with that. I think it's also inevitable, and that Bitcoin is good for all these institutions, including the governments, to have a superior money and way to save, a superior reserve asset, is a good thing. And I don't think the 4 million, it's hilarious, because it's just like, that's one government, and there's just no way the government's going to sit back and allow that one government to do that. And then you just think about the pension funds, and you think of the endowments, and you think about all the corporations, and it gets kind of silly with how scarce Bitcoin is. And so they can try to get that, but there's going to be quite a lot of price slippage, is what I would say.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So Sam, we've talked about offline about how I heard you on a podcast about a month ago, Scarce Assets by Andy and Jesse, who do a great job with that show. And towards the end, they asked you, what area are you most interested in studying and looking into and watching? And your answer was the corporate adoption of Bitcoin. Obviously, we just laid out, for the past 15 minutes, we laid out a lot of reasons of why, the time is now. But curious if you have any other, elaboration on that maybe we haven't hit on, or why that's such an area of interest for you.
Well, I think, there was a lot of excitement when MicroStrategy came in, but we didn't really see it that cycle. We thought that there was going to be a ton of them because it just makes so much sense. But I think the market kind of needed to see the case study play out, and wow, it's played out pretty well for MicroStrategy. And now there's like a few other coming along. There was obviously those like accounting barriers that had to get brought down a little bit. But also, I just think the regulatory clarity is there now, and the education level is there now. And we're going to really start to see momentum at the corporate level in terms of the adoption. And it's just one of the reasons I'm excited about it, because Michael Saylor brings up this concept of a zombie company, but he doesn't mean it in the traditional way it's defined, where it's like a company can't pay interest on its debt for more than, I think, 3/4. I forget what the exact definition is, but I would consider those companies like, terminally ill, or like hospice companies or something like that. The way that Michael Saylor says a zombie company, it's these companies that they're profitable, they're cash rich, but they're not innovating and they're not growing really. And there's no way they're going to compete with their competitors. So MicroStrategy is like, how are we going to compete with Google and Amazon over the next 15, 20 years? And he's like, we're not. We're just like this zombie company who's profitable, they're cash rich, but like, where are we going from here? And he also said, like, our strategy, the Bitcoin corporate strategy, is the easiest to replicate in terms of, if you want to be the next NVIDIA, if you want to be the next Microsoft, you can just adopt a Bitcoin treasury strategy and transform your business. And that's kind of what we're seeing now trickle out with Semler Scientific. Now we had another announcement, I think OneMed, I forgot the exact name, OneMed something. But, you're seeing this trickle out because these companies that are zombie companies that have really been good companies, but they're just kind of, status quo, humming along. They just transform themselves, and then their stock, their trading volumes skyrocket. The interest in their stock skyrockets. Their shares are suddenly being talked about everywhere. They transform their investment base, shareholder base completely transforms, and suddenly they're this exciting company. And I think so many more companies are going to recognize this as they see more and more of these case studies. And just look at the stock performance of every one of these companies that has adopted Bitcoin. It's incredible. So you could say that's from hype, or you could say that's also from the market's telling you that it really likes a Bitcoin treasury strategy. And I think there's a ton of opportunity. I mean, there's just a crazy amount of opportunity from everybody, from fund managers who are looking at this, who are corporations themselves, people building the infrastructure like you, Joe. I think Bitcoin per share, that metric is completely alpha right now, and more people need to understand that. And then nobody really does understand it, so that creates an incredible opportunity. So Bitcoin per share, that's the metric that everyone should be focusing on, but nobody really is.
And to go on that, Sam, Saylor talks a lot. I was at his Bitcoin for Corporations conference a few months ago, and he talks about how if you're one of these zombie companies, you basically have three options, and it's to acquire, be acquired, or to find an equal merger. And I know Joe has thrown some stats around from Harvard Business School about the large majority of acquisitions that just don't work, whether it's a culture fit or it's a tech fit. It's not the right time. Maybe the authorities start to step in and say, no, you're not allowed to acquire this or be acquired by this. And Bitcoin stepping in as that perfect partner, regardless of the size. But even for, I mean, we're talking on the corporation level right now, but even for the mom and pop shop, the local small business, they obviously aren't publicly traded, but they get to utilize the same network that Michael Saylor, in the future Dell, One Med, Sandler Scientific, they're using the same network and they get to benefit from the same price appreciation. So that's why here at Acropolis, we're looking to service everything from the mom and pop shops all the way up to the publicly tradeds that don't really have a way out other than Bitcoin.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting, like in the SMB space, like when it comes to like acquisition entrepreneurship for new entrepreneurs or people that are pursuing a roll-up strategy, it's like maybe you want to do roll-ups, but you're not operationally efficient. What should you do with capital you have? Deploy it into Bitcoin. Well, what if you're a public corporation? Well, there's the case study of IBM, who they've purchased more of their stock back than their current market cap. So buying back your own stock doesn't necessarily lead to long-term value. And what are you going to do one day? Sell off a ton of it and lose trust of investors? Like, why not buy Bitcoin, which, look at Metaplanet, for instance. I thought it was interesting. They bought 2 million a few weeks ago, and their market cap, I believe, went up like billions of dollars. So if you want to create shareholder value, it's super rational to buy Bitcoin. And when it comes to like wanting to invest in future R&D and really have a business that lasts hundreds of years, because most businesses, 75% fail and don't make it to like $1 million in revenue. And then over the next 3 to 4 years, the other 75% that made it fail. Most businesses don't live to be 100 years anyways. So if you really want to weather this technological change where AI is taking over things, clearly Bitcoin has a role, and the labor market is, challenged, it makes sense to have a Bitcoin strategy. And I think one of those things applies to at least 75% of businesses.
Yeah, no question.
Pretty
It's
incredible.
if it's just one company or two companies, a market observer could think, oh, this is just might be some sort of like GameStop situation. There's just a lot of hype. People are talking about it on the chat forums. But once it becomes a handful of companies and then the sixth and the seventh and the eighth comes in, it's becoming clear that the market is rewarding and saying the easiest way to announce publicly that we're thinking about the future and building from a strong foundation is by incorporating Bitcoin into your treasury. Simple as that. The market speaks. This is not just a bunch of Bitcoiners getting excited. This is significant capital. And I love, Sam, your distinction on the zombie companies, because when most people hear it, they probably assume we're talking about companies that aren't going to survive another 3 years or 5 years, when that's not really the case. They're just kind of chugging along. When they think out in terms of 1 or 2 decades, they don't really have a clear path to advance and invest in the technology disruption coming with AI. And they're not really having a treasury strategy that's also building them to the future, right? So they have all these poor options with traditional treasury management. And I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but you have just sitting in cash. You have utilizing T-bills and money market funds. You have, prior to Bitcoin, commodities weren't really a good option. You can only hold 40% in securities. And even if you did, you're not differentiating yourself from what just an average person can do. Then you have acquisitions and share buybacks that we've talked on before. So what happens? You have all these poor options that aren't really building you to the future. So they do a little bit of each of them, and it helps to mask how none of them are really setting themselves up for the future. It masks, some of the downfalls of each one of them. So, it's just really, it's really fascinating situation we find ourselves in, and you're almost on pins and needles of who's going to announce next. On the OneMedNet announcement that you mentioned, Sam, what I love about it is it's only $1.8 million, but it's still big news. If an individual or a family office came out and publicly said, we bought $1.8 million of Bitcoin, that wouldn't be news. And someone could say, well, that's because it's not public. But even if it was, the reality is that this is a business, and even if they have a small cap table, even if there's only a few decision makers, the reality is the market is perceiving businesses as needing to have a further level of conviction and alignment in order to pull the trigger on Bitcoin as a treasury asset. So the fact that OneMedNet at a $1.8 million purchase was getting shared and reposted as much as it was, it just shows you the excitement. All these balance sheets out there, how much just green grass there is, and each domino just keeps adding up.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the perception of the company. I think that's actually it's super important because even when MicroStrategy came on the scene, I didn't know who MicroStrategy was. I mean, they were a zombie company. Their share price was not getting love at all, even though they're profitable and all this stuff. But come on, I didn't really know who they were. And then they come on huge, and obviously now they're one of the most highly traded stocks some days in the entire stock market, in terms of their trading activity and volumes. And same thing happened with Semler Scientific. I heard on stage at the conference, they said that a couple of days after the announcement, their stock traded 20 times the previous year average volume. And then he said something interesting, which is the increased volume leads to all these other opportunities, because they would try to buy private companies. And before, I think he said there was a lot of worry from the private companies that they would get stock in return and then they wouldn't be able to sell the stock, right? There would be a ton of slippage because it's not very liquid. But now there's stocks trading much more, heavy volume and much more liquid. And so these private companies, they can go in and offer to buy them, and they're like, yeah, let's do it, because they're not worried about receiving stock in return, and because they'll just be able to sell it. So the Bitcoin strategy has these second order effects that benefit the company. And then the volume and the liquidity and the interest allows them to raise more money, right? Go to the equity market, go to the debt market, and then they can turn around and buy more Bitcoin. That's the next level of the Bitcoin adoption, right? But it's crazy. It's this feedback loop, and this is why I'm so excited about it, because it's these companies get this orange adrenaline shot in them. They've just been trucking along, and then it's bam, we're this Bitcoin company, all this interest, all this benefits that it brings, and I think we're just scratching the surface.
We have one note to kind of share, guys, from the 2024 Global Family Office Report from JP Morgan. About 45% of assets are in alternative assets, so private equity, real estate, venture, hedge funds, private credit. Bitcoin falls under alternative assets, and I would really begin to think that as it relates to venture and private credit, it could start to replace some of that. I don't know. I'd be interested in some of y'all's takes, but their family offices are stepping a bit more out on the risk curve with different alternative assets just because of inflation. I've seen that shift over the last probably 2 years.
I'd say Bitcoin is the least risky of all of the other options that you just listed. When you're talking about private investments, you're relying on the execution of that team. If you're talking about real estate, it needs to be in a good area. It needs to not be in a COVID office downturn. I mean, there's so many risks. And when you're buying Bitcoin, really the only risk that you need to account for, other than understanding the asset, is the custody piece of it. You need to make sure that you don't lose the Bitcoin, because, if you lose it, it's good as nothing, obviously. But yeah, those are my thoughts there.
Yeah, I think it goes back to similar to Sailor's talk. I mean, which these family offices, it's always about building generational wealth and inheritance, right? How do we protect the family's wealth? So they have really long time horizons. It's like, what asset's going to survive over the next several decades? And it kind of echoes what Mason says. I mean, there's risks like venture capital. I mean, how many startups fail? Like a ton. Like 99% of them completely fail, go to zero. It's like the 80-20 principle, right? I mean, so venture capital is also highly illiquid as well. And whereas Bitcoin's not, and same with like private equity, same thing. And so you're depending on, there's like a lot of risks there that don't exist with Bitcoin. I would say with Bitcoin, there's the custody risk, but there's also like technical risk, which I mean, it's just something to be aware of. You can't really, combat that. You just hope that there's not going to be some kind of self-inflicted wound. But other than that, I mean, if I'm going to hold something over decades and decades, it's going to be Bitcoin. So family offices have been coming in. I actually spoke with like multiple ones at the conference. And I told them like the custody component's the only thing that you should be really worrying about. How do you secure it? Because that's how you're going to mess up. And then over at Swan, I mean, we had family offices coming out, and it makes a lot of sense with them because they're more flexible in terms of their investment mandates. They don't have, like some of these pension funds, some of these other institutional investors have investment mandates, whereas family offices are much more flexible. And so them and like endowments, I'd say, are like the next institutional investors that I would see adoption happening more rapidly, like acceleration, if you will. And so, yeah, I'm super bullish on family offices. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Everyone has to protect against currency debasement, and they're no different.
Absolutely. Yeah, the multi-decade approach is a perfect match for Bitcoin's long-term value potential. And then you throw in the nice kicker and sweetener that it has the liquidity of a short-term investment. So, echo all of those thoughts. So curious if Sam and the group, do you guys have any corporate strategy, corporate adoption predictions or contrarian takes?
I'll let somebody else go.
I think I jumped the gun earlier and I said Dell. That's not really contrarian. I used to work at Dell on their
Nice.
finance team, and it seems pretty clear that they're the next big corporate out there where Michael Dell, I believe, owns 60% of the company still, has controlling decision and controlling shares over the operation of the company. And I made a video about it. I make YouTube videos occasionally, sort of breaking down how Dell is not a stranger to doing wacky financing activities. They really thrived through the 90s, and 2000s was a little bit shaky for them in the early 2000s because people thought that computers weren't going to be as popular. It was going to be everyone was using mobile and sort of iPads and whatnot. And what they did in the early 2010s was take their company private with Silver Lake. They went out and bought the largest server company, EMC, and then they went public again. And ever since then, Dell has been up and to the right. And if it wasn't for this taking the company private and doing this really wacky financing activity, I'm not sure that they'd be the leader in computers like they are today. So I think him hanging around with the right people, he's obviously been spending time with Saylor. I think we'll see Dell coming up next as that big next corporate to start buying Bitcoin.
What are your thoughts, Sam?
That whole deal, like with Dell, is one of the more badass things I've ever read about. Like, probably, I thought Michael Dell probably leveraged the low rate environment of like leveraging that cheap debt better than anybody else in the 2010s. And he did it to buy back his own company. And the reason he did it was awesome because he wanted to focus on the long term. He wanted to innovate, and like he didn't want to get stuck with like focusing on the short term quarterly profits. This is from my understanding. And then he was able to do things like acquire that company that Mason mentioned, totally revolutionize and transform the business, and then go public again. So I agree. Like Michael Dell, I would love to have him on Team Bitcoin. Like, I think he's a genius. I think he's an amazing leader, and he would just be great to have on the team. And like in terms of like what I think, we talked about this on our panel, Joe, but how this kind of happens on the periphery. So it's going to be these zombie companies that we mentioned who maybe you've never even heard their names. They're kind of trucking along, profitable and durable cash flows. But it really comes down to, I think one of the biggest obstacles is the board. of the company. And like you mentioned Michael Dell, he has controlling shares, he has voting rights. Much more easier when you have an innovative leader who has that power over the board to make big decisions like that. One thing to look at is like stock ownership at the board level. A lot of these board members seem to just collect a paycheck. They're not really interested in maximizing shareholder value. But if you find a board where the board members themselves own a lot of the equity, then yeah, they'll be interested in maximizing shareholder value. So it could be interesting to go in there and start educating them about Bitcoin strategies. And so I do think you'll see it kind of adopted on the periphery with boardrooms who have shown like a flexibility and open-mindedness and then have a high degree of share ownership. But then there'll be these like white swans, right? There'll be this like, I think there'll be like a Dell, but also like, some kind of Apple or something like out of nowhere. There's going to be this giant corporation that has seen enough. They've seen MicroStrategy dominating. They see all these Bitcoin companies dominating. They're going to like, hey, we're going to do this. And that's when you have this white swan event where it's not just these small companies now, then it's like the big ones coming in, and it's going to happen probably faster than people think. Because once one goes, then it's just like, why did they do it? And then it just trickles down and it gets momentum. And that's when things are going to get really weird. And so that's kind of it's going to happen at the periphery, but then white swan event, some company, like look at the ones like, pretty sure Google has, if Sergey and Larry Page teamed up, combined their shares, they could do something crazy. I know Zuckerberg has a lot of controlling interest still in Meta. So like there are companies where it's favorable, like the leader does hold a lot of the voting rights, but we'll see which one it is. I don't know. But Dell's a good guess. I hope it's Dell because I'm just a big Michael Dell fan.
I'm a big Michael Dell fan as well. I think he's one of the most underappreciated entrepreneurs. I think he's up there with, the Zuckerbergs and all of that. But on Apple, obviously, I don't think Apple's coming anytime soon into the Bitcoin space, but they have indicated to the market that they don't know what to do with their extra capital. They announced the largest share buyback in history. I think it was 110 billion. And they have a fiduciary duty to return that capital to the shareholders if they don't know what to do with it. And they're clearly out working on cars and they're working on all the craziest R&D that they can work on. And even after all of that, they still say, oh, we have an extra 110 billion. Here you go, shareholders. And once they have the signal from other large companies that allows them to go start buying Bitcoin for their treasury, then we're absolutely off to the races and all of your models are broken.
Yeah, because they all have the same problem, right? They're sitting on the melting ice cube problem. But yeah, that's a great point.
As far as predictions, I think what we see is by mid or Q3 2025, companies that adopt a Bitcoin strategy don't see some massive price pump of, like 1,600% like we saw Metaplanet. It might double maybe. But what's going to happen is more nation states are going to adopt it. More people are going to rapidly buy. A lot of these zombie companies will be buying, 3 to 4 other large corporations will. And it's just going to become normal. Now, the other thing that's really going to accelerate it, I see a lot of folks talking about Republicans are underestimating Kamala Harris. And this guy, I don't know who he is, but apparently he's predicted the last 4 presidents accurately online. And he's saying Kamala's winning 6 of his 10 metrics and Trump has 3. If Harris wins, I think a lot of businesses are going to take maybe potentially more swift actions to acquire Bitcoin, and that's going to accelerate it even more. But I think it gets diminished over time, like the stock price pump, 2,000% in 6 months. I don't think every stock's going to be Metaplanet, so it is a race in the short term. But by mid Q3 of 2025, I bet it becomes slightly more normal. You're still contrarian, but you're not going to see these ridiculous price pumps. I think volatility is going to dampen quite a bit.
Why do you think that they'll be more swift in a Harris victory? Exactly.
I think with some of the things that Democrats are just proposing, as far as funding the war in Ukraine, and then as far as solving climate change, the $78 trillion supposedly Yellen's wanting, they're not going to get full $78 trillion, but they're going to use as much as they can for their goals and initiatives. I think if those things do happen, that's just going to lead to more capital misallocation, more money in the system, and people leaning on something else outside of the dollar. But I'm not an analyst, so I could be wrong. I think this is just based on like human behavior more so, like psychology. But I don't necessarily have numbers to back it. It's just the psychology thing I think is going to happen.
Inflation risk. Like the companies will be more worried about the inflation risk. Harris.
That's a great contrarian take, because although their policies may not be embracing Bitcoin, their policies are about increased government spending, which leads us quicker to the path of realization of Bitcoin. So I like that take, Bob.
What about you, Joe? You got any takes?
No, I'd echo what you guys said mostly. I think self-preservation is an amazing force and going to be the driver. And then there's going to be a couple surprises along the way. So, expect the unexpected, but there will be more big names that people just didn't really see coming. And mostly it's just going to be those self-preservation decisions on the outskirts. You guys, any last thoughts, last topics, questions?
Mason, do you have...
No, nothing on my end. I think we've covered it pretty well. I think we've really focused on the corporates this episode, but like I said earlier, it applies to everyone from the smallest company that you can imagine to the largest, being Apple's and the Nvidias. But yeah, it's been a good rip.
Yeah, that is a good point, and this is something Bobby probably knows more about. But there's just so many of these small, cash-rich businesses, like a car wash, like that's been operated for a long time by like a baby boomer or something. There's so many opportunities. I've been going on these like websites where you can like buy small businesses, they're like cash rich. They haven't like upgraded any, they have no social media presence, like don't even use like a Square thing. There's so many ways to upgrade just the operations of the business to increase revenues. And then you think about like adopting Bitcoin with these like small little businesses as well, or they own like the real estate that the business is on, and like maybe you can like wrap that up in a HELOC and then like take the proceeds and buy Bitcoin with it. Like you can probably do crazy stuff, and so that exists everywhere though. Like every single business could probably benefit from adopting Bitcoin, which is, it just gets wild to think about. And yeah, I think we're in the very, 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 very early stages of all this.
Well said, my friend. I think that's the perfect way to wrap episode 2, New Foundations. Thanks, Mason and Sam, for jumping on with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the show. A quick reminder that New Foundations is for informational and entertainment purposes, and nothing should be construed as investment, financial, or legal advice. Business owners, business operators, and those who are Bitcoin curious, let's connect. Visit acropolistreasury.com to learn more or to get in touch with our team.